The sound of screeching tires and blaring sirens shattered the peaceful afternoon on Maple Grove Circle. I watched from my garage as 3 unmarked black SUVs careened around the corner, their engines roaring as they came to an abrupt stop in front of my house. Federal agents in full tactical gear poured out like a swarm of angry wasps, their weapons drawn and movements precise. Standing on my front lawn, phone still pressed to her ear, was Karen Whitfield, the HOA president. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at my front door, her face a mixture of triumph and terror. The whole scene unfolded in less than 45 seconds from the moment she dialed 911. Let me back up and explain how we got here. My name is Marcus Chen, and I moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood in Riverside Heights about 18 months ago. I chose this place specifically because it was unremarkable, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business. Or so I thought. What I hadn't counted on was Karen Whitfield, a 52-year-old real estate agent who ruled the Homeowners Association with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive smiles. From day one, Karen made it clear she didn't like me. Maybe it was because I kept to myself, or perhaps it was the fact that I worked odd hours and received deliveries at strange times. She would stand at her kitchen window with her binoculars, not even trying to hide her surveillance. I knew she kept a notebook documenting every perceived infraction, from my grass being a quarter-inch too long, to the time a delivery truck idled in my driveway for 6 minutes instead of the HOA-mandated 5. The afternoon everything went sideways started like any other. I was in my home office working on some sensitive documents when I heard the familiar click-clack of Karen's heels on the sidewalk. She was doing her daily patrol, clipboard in hand, looking for violations. I had learned to tune out her presence, treating her like background noise. That was my first mistake. I needed to access my safe, a heavy-duty model installed in my home office. The mechanism had been sticking lately, and I had to use a bit more force than usual. The loud clang echoed through the house as the bolt finally released. Then came the whirring sound of my electric drill as I worked on adjusting the internal mechanisms. Through my peripheral vision, I caught a flash of movement outside my office window. Karen's face was pressed against the glass, her hands cupped around her eyes to see better. I continued my work, figuring she would eventually get bored and move on. But Karen's imagination was already running wild. She scurried back to her house, no doubt to retrieve her high-powered binoculars. From her bedroom window, which had a partial view into my office, she watched as I opened the safe fully. What she saw inside made her gasp, loud enough that I could hear it from across the property line. Inside the safe were stacks of documents marked with official seals, several pieces of equipment that admittedly looked intimidating to the untrained eye, and various metal cases with electronic locks. To Karen's suburban sensibilities, it must have looked like something out of a spy movie. Ironically, that wasn't far from the truth. Karen's hands shook as she dialed 911. I could hear her shrill voice carrying across the yard as she spoke to the dispatcher. She was using words like weapons, cash, chemical materials, and terrorist threat. She claimed she had witnessed me breaking into a safe filled with what appeared to be bombs and classified government documents. The dispatcher asked her to repeat that last part, and Karen doubled down, insisting she had seen documents marked top secret. What Karen didn't know was that certain keywords in emergency calls trigger automated responses. When someone reports stolen classified materials or threats to national security, it doesn't go through normal channels. The dispatcher told Karen to stay on the line and remain where she was. That should have been her first clue that something unusual was happening. I was still adjusting the safe when I heard the vehicles approaching. The sound was distinctive, heavy engines moving fast. The kind of coordinated movement that comes from extensive training. I sighed, closed the safe, and walked to my front window. Sure enough, the federal response team was already in position. These weren't local cops responding to a burglary call. These were professionals who had been monitoring the situation from the moment Karen mentioned those magic words. The team moved with surgical precision. The lead agent's voice boomed through a megaphone, ordering me to exit with my hands visible. I complied immediately, stepping out my front door with my hands raised. Karen was still on my lawn, her face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. She had expected vindication, but the gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. As I walked slowly down my driveway, I reached for my wallet with deliberate movements. The lead agent, a tall man with sharp eyes, approached cautiously. I handed him my identification. Not the driver's license Karen had seen me use at the HOA meetings, but a different credential entirely. His expression shifted immediately, from suspicion to understanding, then to barely contained anger. He barked orders to his team to stand down, then turned his attention to Karen. She was still clutching her phone, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The agent asked her to describe exactly what she had seen and what she had reported. As she stammered through her explanation, embellishing even more than she had on the phone, I could see the agent's jaw tightening. Back inside my house, I opened the safe again, this time with several agents present. The lead agent, whose name was Director Harrison, examined the contents with a knowing look. The documents were indeed classified. The equipment was indeed sensitive. And everything in that safe was worth more than every house on the street combined. But none of it was stolen, and none of it was illegal for me to possess. Director Harrison turned to me with an apologetic expression. Agent Chun, I'm sorry about this. We had no choice but to respond when the call came in. I nodded, understanding the protocol. What followed was a careful dance of revealing just enough information to satisfy the immediate situation without compromising ongoing operations. Karen was brought inside, her designer heels clicking nervously on my hardwood floors. Director Harrison explained, in terms vague enough to maintain security, but clear enough to convey the severity, that she had just compromised a federal operation. Her 911 call hadn't just brought local law enforcement. It had triggered a national security response, pulling resources from active investigations and potentially exposing personnel whose safety depended on anonymity. The legal terms started flying fast. Obstruction of justice, interference with federal operations, false reporting, and reckless endangerment were just the beginning. Karen's face had gone from red to white to a sickly green. She kept insisting she was just being a good neighbor, that she was protecting the community. Director Harrison wasn't buying it. He had already pulled her history of complaints against me, a file thick enough to use as a doorstop. As the afternoon wore on, more officials arrived. Some wore suits. Others wore uniforms I didn't recognize. Each one looked at Karen with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. A junior agent was tasked with taking her full statement, documenting every instance of her surveillance, every photo she had taken, every note she had made about my activities. What had seemed like harmless nosiness was suddenly evidence of a pattern of harassment against a federal agent. The real blow came when Director Harrison informed Karen that she would need to retain a lawyer. The government would be pursuing charges. And while they might show some leniency given her ignorance, the fact that she had exaggerated her report with mentions of weapons and chemicals elevated the severity. She had essentially called in a false terrorism threat, whether she meant to or not. Karen's professional life unraveled faster than a cheap sweater. The real estate agency where she worked couldn't afford the publicity of having an agent under federal investigation. Her broker's license was suspended pending review. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that very evening and, by a unanimous vote, removed her from her position as president. Some board members were former military and understood the gravity of what she had done. The financial hits came next. Her lawyer, a nervous man who specialized in property disputes and was clearly out of his depth, informed her that defending against federal charges would require a specialist. The retainer alone was $50,000. The potential fines, if convicted, started at $100,000 and went up from there. Her house, the crown jewel of her perfectly manicured life, would likely need to be mortgaged to pay for her defense. But the number that really made Karen's knees buckle was when the prosecutor mentioned potential jail time. Interfering with federal operations carried a maximum sentence of 5 years. Filing a false report that triggered a national security response added another 3. The prosecutor was considering whether her pattern of harassment constituted stalking of a federal agent, which could add 5 more. Karen collapsed into a chair in my living room, the fight completely drained from her. She mumbled something about just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, but even she didn't seem to believe it anymore. The reality was setting in. Her need to control everything, her obsession with finding violations, her inability to mind her own business had finally caught up with her. And unlike an HOA fine for grass that was too long, she couldn't simply pay this away. As the federal agents prepared to leave, Director Harrison pulled me aside. He apologized again for the disruption and assured me that measures would be taken to prevent this from happening again. Karen would be released for now, but would be under strict orders not to approach me, speak to me, or even look in my direction. Any violation would result in immediate arrest. The last thing I heard as they escorted Karen out was the prosecutor.